What would you do if doing the right thing cost you everything you had? If you were dismissed, disgraced, and left with nothing but a stubborn mule and the dust of the Arizona Territory on your boots? This is the story of a young woman who was cast out for her integrity, who paid the price for refusing to bend. But what happened next, in the heart of a forgotten canyon, would change not only her life, but the history of the very company that wronged her. The truth was waiting, suspended between heaven and earth, in a place no one had dared to look for a decade. Settle in and stay close. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, as we travel back to a time when honesty was a dangerous currency, and justice could be found in the most impossible of places. The air in the Blackwater Freight and Stage Depot was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, hot dust, and the lie Stella Hark refused to tell. It was a simple lie, a matter of changing a number in a ledger. A 7 to a 9. A simple stroke of a pen to claim a delivery of grain had spoiled in transit when it had, in fact, been sold off the back of the wagon by the driver for a pocketful of silver. Marcus Thorne, the new regional agent for the Overland Stage Company, had made the request sound like a housekeeping chore, as if tidying a shelf. His smile was a thin, dry crack in his sun-browned face. "It's just paper, Miss Hark," he'd said, his voice smooth as a worn saddle. "The company accounts for loss. It's tidier this way." Stella kept her eyes on the ledger, on the neat column of numbers she had been taught to keep by her father, a man who believed a person's word, and their books were the measure of their soul. "The grain wasn't lost, Mr. Thorne. It was sold." Driver Jim admitted as much. Thorne's smile vanished. "Driver Jim is a half-wit who won't have a job come morning, and neither will you, if you can't see the sense in this." She looked up at him then, her gaze steady. At 25, her face was already shaped by the wind and the sun, her hands calloused from hauling freight and mending harnesses. She was not a woman given to speeches. Her refusal was in her silence, in the way her jaw was set. She had lost her parents to fever 2 years prior, lost her family's small ranch to the bank a year after that. This job, this small room behind the depot counter, was all she had left. And now she was losing it too. For a 7 that wouldn't become a 9. "I can't change the number," she said, her voice quiet but firm as desert rock. An hour later, her belongings were packed in a single canvas sack, slung over the back of her mule, Silas. The mule, a veteran of a dozen dusty trails, stood with the stoic patience of his kind, his long ears occasionally twitching at the sound of Thorne's raised voice from inside the depot. Ben Carter, the station owner who had hired her, came out, his face a portrait of apology. He was a good man caught under a bad man's thumb. He pressed a small leather pouch into her hand. "It ain't much, Stella," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. "Some jerky, hardtack, enough to get you to your aunt's place in the Verde Valley. I'm sorry." Thorne's got the whole line in his pocket. "It's not your fault, Ben," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. She had learned long ago that the world had little use for a woman's tears. She swung herself up onto Silas's broad back. There was no grand farewell, just the creak of leather, the soft scuff of a hoof in the dirt. She turned the mule's head west, toward the vast, indifferent expanse of the territory, toward a 3-day ride to a relative she hadn't seen in a decade. As she rode out of Blackwater, she didn't look back. She felt the weight of the town's eyes on her, the whispers already starting. The foolish girl who threw away a steady wage over a number in a book. The sun was hot on her shoulders, a merciless, pressing heat that promised a long and lonely journey. The world felt immense and empty, and she felt impossibly small within it, a solitary figure moving slowly toward a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. The only comfort was the familiar, rhythmic plod of Silas beneath her, a steady heartbeat in a silent, unforgiving land. The second day of her journey west found Stella and Silas deep within the winding jaws of Scorpion Canyon. The name was no poetry. The land was baked ochre and rust, studded with prickly pear and the skeletal remains of cholla, The sun beat down on the canyon walls, and the heat rose from the sandy floor in shimmering waves, making the air itself seem to tremble. All morning, the only sounds had been the plodding of Silas's hooves, the creak of worn leather, and the buzz of unseen insects. Stella rode with her hat pulled low, her thoughts as dry and sparse as the landscape. She was heading for the Verde Valley, for the charity of a half-forgotten aunt. Her future a blank page she had no ink to write on. The injustice of her dismissal was a hard stone in her gut. She had done the right thing. Her father's face, stern and kind, swam in her memory. A person is only as good as their ledger, he used to say, tapping the thick, leather-bound book where he tracked every dollar earned, every bushel harvested. The numbers don't lie, and neither should you. Suddenly, Silas stopped. He froze mid-stride, his body rigid, his long ears swiveling forward like twin guidons. Stella felt the shift immediately. She straightened, her hand resting on the mule's neck to calm him, her eyes scanning the canyon ahead. She saw nothing at first, just the towering walls of red rock, the endless blue sky above. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, her voice a dry whisper. Silas snorted, a low, guttural sound of unease, and tossed his head, directing her gaze upward. And then she saw it. It was so impossible, so utterly out of place, that for a moment her mind refused to process it. High up, at least 80 feet above the canyon floor, wedged into a deep scar in the rock face, was a stagecoach. It was tilted at a sickening angle, one wheel shattered, its once bright paint bleached to the color of bone by a decade of sun. It looked like a child's toy dropped and forgotten by a giant. Stella slid from the mule's back, her boots sinking into the soft sand, her mouth agape. She knew the story. Everyone in the territory knew the story. 10 years ago, the Salt River Express, carrying the monthly payroll for the miners up north, had vanished in a summer flash flood. They'd found the bodies of the driver and the guard miles downstream, but the coach, the passengers, and the strongbox had never been recovered. It was assumed they were buried under tons of rock and sand, somewhere in this vast, unforgiving network of canyons. But here it was, not buried, lifted, thrown by the unimaginable power of the floodwaters, and caught, like a fly in a web, high on the cliff face. It was a tomb, a monument to a forgotten tragedy. Most people would have crossed themselves and hurried on. But Stella Hark was a woman, with nothing left to lose, and a habit of looking at things others dismissed. She saw a wreck, yes, but she also saw salvage. Seasoned wood, perhaps, iron fittings. Anything she could pack out and sell for a few dollars would be more than she had now. It was a fool's hope, a desperate grasp at a splinter of possibility. But desperation was the currency of her new life. She looked from the spectral coach, back down to Silas, who was now calmly nibbling at a patch of stubborn scrubgrass, his alarm having passed. The climb would be treacherous, a sheer wall of crumbling sandstone and sharp-edged scree. It was a risk that could cost her dearly, but the world had already taken so much. What was one more risk? She would climb. What would you do? Would you risk your life for the forgotten scraps of a decade-old disaster? Or would you turn away, leaving the dead to their high and lonely grave? Let us know what you would choose in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of incredible discoveries. Now, as Stella stood at the base of that cliff, staring up at the ghost coach, she had no idea that the real treasure wasn't the wood or the iron, but a secret the flood had tried to wash away forever. The memory of her departure from Blackwater returned to her then, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass. She stood at the base of the cliff, the sun hot on her neck, but in her mind, she was back on the dusty street, the town watching her go. She could still hear the whispers of the men loafing on the porch of the general store, their voices carrying on the dry air like rustling leaves. Too proud for her own good, one had said. Ben Carter should have hired a man, said another. She had kept her face forward, her expression a careful mask of indifference she had perfected over years of being the only woman in a world of men's work. Then, Marcus Thorne himself had stepped out of the depot, a smirk playing on his lips. He'd crossed his arms and watched her pass, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "Don't go spending that integrity all in one place, Miss Hark. It don't buy oats for the mule." The laughter that followed was a physical thing, a wave of scorn that washed over her. She hadn't flinched, hadn't given him the satisfaction of a reaction. She had just nudged Silas forward, the rhythmic plod of his hooves a steadying counterpoint to the pounding in her chest. Just beyond the last buildings of the town, where the road dissolved into a simple track, she had passed an old prospector named Jedediah. He was a fixture of the landscape, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of the desert sky. He was sitting on a rock, methodically crushing ore with a small hammer, his own mule waiting patiently nearby. He had stopped his work as she approached, his gaze following her not with pity or scorn, but with a strange, unreadable intensity. He looked from her face to the Thunderheads building over the distant mountains, then back again. As she drew level with him, he spoke, his voice a dry rasp, like stones grinding together. "The high water always returns what it took," he'd said. It wasn't a greeting or a farewell. It was a pronouncement. Stella had simply nodded, unsure what to make of the words. She'd assumed he was just a crazy old man, his mind addled by sun and solitude. But now, standing here in Scorpion Canyon, staring up at a stagecoach lifted 80 feet into the air by a historic flood, his cryptic sentence echoed in her mind with the force of prophecy. The high water always returns what it took. It had taken the coach, the payroll, the lives, and now it had returned the coach, presenting it to her like an offering. The memory faded, leaving her back in the oppressive heat of the canyon floor. The mockery of Thorn, the whispers of the town, the old man's strange words. It all coalesced into a single, hard point of resolve in her chest. They saw her as a fool, a dismissed and useless woman. She looked up at the coach, a broken thing left for dead. A kinship resonated between them. She would climb. She would not be defeated by a sheer rock face, any more than she would be by the scorn of men like Thorn. She checked the worn rope coiled at her saddle, tested its strength between her calloused hands. She drank deeply from her canteen, the water tasting of tin and survival. She gave Silas a long, affectionate scratch behind his ears. "You wait here, boy," she murmured. "I'll be back." The mule huffed a soft breath against her cheek, a silent vote of confidence. With the prospector's words still ringing in her ears, she found her first handhold on the crumbling sandstone and began to pull herself up, leaving the world that had cast her out far below. The climb was a conversation between her body and the rock. Every muscle strained, every ounce of her strength was called upon. The sandstone was treacherous, crumbling under her boots and scraping her knuckles raw. The sun was a physical weight on her back, relentless and unforgiving. Twice she felt a handhold give way, sending a shower of grit and pebbles clattering down the cliff face, and her heart leaping into her throat. But she held on, her fingers burning, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She did not look down. To look down was to invite the terrifying, dizzying emptiness of the canyon to swallow her resolve. She focused only on the next hold, the next ledge, the next inch of progress. She moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a woman who knew her own limits, and the cost of a single mistake. After what felt like an eternity, her scraped fingers finally closed over the splintered wood of the coach's undercarriage. With a final, lung-bursting effort, she hauled herself up and over the edge, collapsing onto the tilted floorboards. For a long moment, she just lay there, her cheek pressed against the rough, sun-bleached wood, the world spinning. The only sound was the rasp of her own breathing, and the mournful whistle of the wind through the shattered frame of the coach. When she finally pushed herself to a sitting position, a wave of disappointment washed over her. The coach was a skeleton. Whatever upholstery had once covered the seats was long gone, rotted away, or carried off by birds for their nests. The leather straps of the luggage rack were dry-rotted and cracked, hanging in pathetic tatters. The doors were gone, likely torn from their hinges by the flood. It was empty, picked clean by the patient, relentless forces of nature. The salvage she had risked her life for, amounted to nothing more than a pile of splintered, worthless timber. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, a dry, humorless sound that the wind immediately snatched away. Of course, it was another of the world's cruel jokes, a final testament to her foolishness. Thorne's mocking voice echoed in her head. "Don't go spending that integrity all in one place, Miss Hark." She sat there for a long time as the sun began its slow descent, painting the opposing canyon wall in shades of orange and deep violet. The sheer, breathtaking beauty of the landscape felt like a mockery of her own small, desperate failure. She was exhausted, bruised, and no better off than she had been that morning. Worse even, for having wasted her strength on a fool's errand. She was too tired to attempt the climb down before nightfall. Below, she could see Silas, a small, patient shape in the deepening shadows. She would have to spend the night here, in this coffin, suspended in the sky. She found a relatively level spot on the floorboards, away from the gaping hole where a door had been, and settled in, pulling her thin jacket tight against the cooling air. She had nothing, not even the hope of a few dollars for salvaged iron. As darkness fell, she closed her eyes, the feeling of utter defeat, a cold, heavy blanket. The wind picked up, and a strange, rhythmic thumping began, a sound from deep within the coach's ruined body, a lonely, persistent heartbeat in the vast, silent dark. Sleep did not come easily. The wind grew stronger as the night deepened, a restless presence that moaned through the coach's broken frame, and with the wind came the sound, more insistent now, a dull, rhythmic thump, thump, thump from somewhere beneath her. At first, she tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just a loose piece of wood, a dangling strap, the wind playing tricks. But the sound was too regular, too solid. It wasn't the random clatter of decay. It was the sound of something heavy knocking against its confinement. It was the sound that had bothered her from the moment she had settled down, an anomaly her tired mind had dismissed. Now, in the stark clarity of the cold night, it refused to be ignored. It was a question mark in the darkness. When the first pale light of dawn crept over the canyon rim, Stella was already awake, her body stiff and cold, but her mind sharp with a new and unfamiliar curiosity. The thumping had ceased with the dying of the wind, but its memory lingered. She would not, could not, climb down without knowing what had made that sound. She began a more methodical search of the coach's interior, her fingers probing every crack and joint. She ran her hands along the underside of the roof, checked the rotted floorboards, examined the splintered frame of the driver's box. Nothing. It was all just wreckage. Just the sad, empty shell she had seen yesterday. She was about to give up, to chalk the sound up to a trick of the wind and her own exhaustion, when she crouched to look under the forward passenger seat. The space was dark, choked with ancient dust and cobwebs, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. Tucked deep in the shadows, almost invisible against the dark wood, was a length of thick leather. It wasn't cracked and frayed like the other straps she'd seen. This one was different. It was heavy harness leather, the kind used for hauling, and it had been treated with oil, which had preserved it from the worst of the elements. It was wrapped tightly around something solid, bolted directly to the frame of the coach itself, and it was fastened not with a simple buckle, but with a complex, interlocking knot, a knot she recognized. It was a mule skinner's hitch, a knot designed to hold under extreme tension and never slip. It was a knot her own father had taught her. No passenger would have tied this. No stagecoach driver would have used it for simple luggage. This was deliberate. This was meant to hide something, and to hold it fast against any force. This was the source of the thumping. Whatever was bound by that strap had been knocking against the floorboards all night. A fresh wave of adrenaline coursed through her, chasing away the last of her fatigue. This was no longer about salvage. The careful preservation of the strap, the professional knot, the deliberate concealment, it all spoke of something far more significant. Her disappointment from the day before evaporated, replaced by a focused, burning intensity. The world had dismissed this coach as a lost cause, an empty tomb, but someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that one part of it, One secret piece would survive. She drew the small, sturdy knife from the sheath on her belt. The leather was thick, and the space was awkward, but her hands, accustomed to hard work, were steady. She began to saw at the strap, the blade grating against the tough, oiled hide. What was hidden here? What secret had been waiting, silent and patient, for a decade in the desert sun? The work was slow and arduous. Stella had to contort her body into the cramped space beneath the seat, her shoulder pressed against the splintered wood, her arm aching with the effort. The mule skinner's hitch was a marvel of engineering, designed to tighten under strain, and 10 years of sun and tension had fused it into a solid mass. Sawing through the strap felt like cutting through ironwood. With each stroke of her knife, a fine dust of dried leather preservative filled the air, smelling of pine tar and age. Below, Silas watched her, his head cocked, a silent, still observer on the canyon floor. He had been her only companion for so long that his presence felt like an extension of her own consciousness. His quiet patience mirrored her own stubborn determination. She worked without stopping, her focus absolute. The mockery of Marcus Thorne, the pitying looks of the townspeople, the gnawing uncertainty of her future. It all fell away, replaced by the simple, physical reality of the task at hand. The blade, the leather, the secret. Finally, with a loud crack, the last fibers of the strap gave way. The tension released, and a heavy object, freed from its bonds, slid forward with a solid, metallic thud. Stella scrambled back, pulling it out from under the seat and into the morning light. It was an iron strongbox, about 2 feet long and a foot high, its surface pitted with rust, but otherwise intact. It was immensely heavy. She tried to lift it with one hand and could barely budge it. It was fastened with a heavy lock, the keyhole plugged with a decade of hardened dirt. A wave of triumph, cold and sharp, washed through her. This was it. This was the payroll. The lost Salt River Express treasure. It had to be. But it was more than that. The elaborate hiding of it, the specific knot. This wasn't how a company secured its assets. This was how a thief hid his plunder. Someone had intended for this box to be lost forever in the flood, tied to the coach that would be its tomb, only to be retrieved later from the wreckage. But the flood had been too powerful, lifting the coach and its secret far beyond anyone's reach. She sat back on her heels, her breath coming fast, her mind racing. She was alone, 80 feet up a cliff face, with a locked box that likely held a fortune and a truth that had been buried for 10 years. She could try to break it open here, but she had no tools for the job, and she could never get it down the cliff by herself. It was too heavy, too awkward. To claim this discovery, to unlock its secrets, she needed help. She needed tools. She needed someone with authority. The thought came to her, clear and certain. She couldn't go back to Blackwater. Thorne was there, and her gut told her he was connected to the rot in the company, even if he wasn't part of this specific crime. She needed to go to the nearest outpost of the law, a place far from Thorne's influence. She remembered seeing a signpost days ago, pointing down a little-used trail. Jericho Flats, Deputy's Office, 20 miles. It was a detour, a risk, but it was the only move that felt right. She would leave the box, for now. It had waited 10 years. It could wait another day or two. Carefully, she pushed the heavy box back into its hiding place under the seat, covering it with scraps of rotted canvas. From the canyon floor, it would be invisible. Her decision was made. She would climb down, ride to Jericho Flats, and return with the law. For the first time since leaving Blackwater, she felt a flicker of something that was not despair. It was the fierce, fragile beginning of hope. The ride to Jericho Flats was a blur of grim determination. Stella pushed Silas harder than she normally would. The urgency of her discovery, a spur against her ribs. Jericho Flats wasn't a town so much as a blister on the face of the desert. A dusty saloon, a livery stable, and a small, sun-bleached shack with a faded sign that read, Deputy U.S. Marshal. She found the deputy inside, oiling a rifle. He was a man named Elias Vale, and he moved with the quiet, watchful stillness of a predator. His eyes, the color of faded denim, took her in from head to foot, missing nothing. The raw scrapes on her hands, the dust on her clothes, the exhaustion and fierce resolve in her face. He was not a man who wasted words. "Help you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. She told her story. She kept it simple, factual, laying out the details of the canyon, the coach, the mule skinner's hitch, the iron box. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, the silence in the small office was broken only by the buzz of a fly against the window pane. "A stagecoach?" he said, his tone skeptical. 80 feet up a cliff?" "Yes," she said. "From the flood, 10 years back. The Salt River Express," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He set down his rifle and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. "That's a tall tale, ma'am." "It's the truth," Stella replied, her voice unwavering. The strap that held the box was tied with a mule skinner's hitch, a double-locking hitch. My father was a freighter. I know the knot. That detail seemed to catch his attention. It was specific. It was technical. It wasn't the kind of flourish a person would invent for a tall tale. He was silent for another long moment, studying her face. Elias Vale was a former Army scout, a man who had survived by reading signs, the turn of a leaf, a broken twig, the look in a person's eyes. And in Stella's eyes, he saw no deceit. He saw something he recognized, the hard, unyielding glint of truth. "All right," he said at last, standing up. "I'll ride out with you. But if this is a wild goose chase, you'll answer for wasting my time." They rode back together, two solitary figures, moving through the vast landscape. They spoke little. Elias set a hard pace, and Stella matched it. When they finally reached the mouth of Scorpion Canyon, and she pointed upward, a low whistle escaped his lips. "I'll be damned," he breathed. Getting the strongbox down was a masterclass in skill and patience. Elias, with his scout's knowledge of ropes and rock, directed the operation. He climbed the cliff with an unnerving, spider-like grace, secured a system of pulleys to the coach's sturdy axle, and together, they painstakingly lowered the heavy iron box to the canyon floor. It landed with a solid, final thud. The moment of truth had arrived. Elias knelt beside the box, took a crowbar and a heavy mallet from his saddlebags, and set to work on the lock. The rusted metal screeched in protest. With a final, sharp blow, the lock shattered, and the lid sprang open. They both leaned in. The setting sun cast a long, golden ray of light into the canyon, illuminating the contents of the box, as if on a stage. It was filled to the brim with gold coins. Double eagles, stacked in neat, tight columns, gleaming with a soft, buttery light. A fortune, but Stella's eyes were drawn to a small, oilskin-wrapped packet tucked in amongst the stacks. Elias reached in and carefully lifted it out. He unwrapped the oilskin to reveal a sheaf of letters, their ink remarkably preserved. He took the top letter and began to read aloud, his voice low and grim. "The plan is set," he read. "The driver is ours. He'll stop at the dry wash past Scorpion. The guard will be dealt with. We'll stage the robbery, take the box, and sink the coach. The flood will do the rest. They'll never find it. The company will write it off as a tragedy." Elias paused, his eyes dark. He looked at the bottom of the page. It's signed by Abram Massey. He was the Overland Regional Manager, before Thorne. His gaze met Stella's, and in that moment, everything clicked into place. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a conspiracy from within the company itself, a betrayal of the highest order. The high water hadn't buried the truth. It had preserved it. As the last words of the letter hung in the heavy air, a shadow fell over the canyon. Both Stella and Elias looked up simultaneously. The brilliant blue sky of an hour ago was gone, replaced by a bruised, purple-black canopy of cloud that was rolling in from the west with unnatural speed. The wind suddenly shifted, carrying the distant smell of rain and the low, guttural rumble of thunder. Elias stood up, his eyes scanning the narrow canyon walls. He had seen skies like this before. This wasn't a summer shower. This was a gully washer, a storm that could turn the dry canyon floor into a raging river in minutes. "We have to go," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Now." There was no time to celebrate their discovery, no time to process the magnitude of what they had found. The crisis was upon them, immediate and absolute. They began to work with a frantic, silent efficiency. Elias shoveled the gold coins into their saddlebags, while Stella carefully repacked the precious letters into the oilskin pouch, tucking it safely inside her shirt. The wind began to howl, whipping sand and grit into their faces. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the hot rock, sizzling like water on a skillet. The thunder was closer now, a deafening crack that seemed to split the sky right above them. They had just finished securing the last of the gold when they heard it, a low, terrifying roar from up canyon. The flash flood. "High ground!" Elias yelled over the wind. "Leave the box." They scrambled for their horses, but the animals were panicked, their eyes wide with terror at the storm and the rising sound. Stella grabbed Silas's reins, her voice a low, calming murmur as she fought to control him. Elias was doing the same with his own mount. The roar grew louder, and they could see it now. A churning, brown wall of water, debris, and mud, devouring the canyon floor as it surged toward them. They were running out of time. Just as they managed to swing into their saddles, Stella saw a flash of movement on a low ledge across the wash. It was a family, a man, a woman, and two small children. Their wagon already overturned, caught completely by surprise by the storm's ferocity. They were trapped, the rising water cutting them off. Without a second thought, Stella turned Silas toward them. "We have to help them," she shouted to Elias. He didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse forward, following her into the path of the flood. They reached the terrified family, just as the first wave of water surged around their ankles. Elias, with his strength, lifted the children one by one onto his horse, while Stella helped the frantic parents onto Silas. They were dangerously overloaded, the animals struggling for purchase on the slick, wet rock. With the floodwaters swirling around the horses' legs, they fought their way up a steep, rocky incline to a higher ledge, reaching safety just as the main torrent crashed through the spot where they had been standing seconds before. They huddled together on the narrow ledge, two rescuers, a rescued family, and two heroic animals, as the storm unleashed its full fury. The canyon became a violent river, the water tearing at the cliff face, carrying entire trees in its current. In the midst of the chaos, soaked to the bone and shivering, Stella clutched the oilskin packet to her chest. They had saved the gold, but more importantly, they had saved the truth. And in that moment of shared peril, sheltering strangers from the storm, she understood that her discovery was not just about righting an old wrong. It was about who she chose to be in the face of crisis. It was a test, and she had not been found wanting. They spent the night on that ledge, the storm raging around them. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a transformed canyon floor littered with debris. The family they had rescued, whose names were Miller, could not thank them enough. Mr. Miller, his voice thick with emotion, promised he would tell everyone of their bravery. The journey back to the main town of Prescott, where the territorial U.S. Marshal's office was located, was slow and somber. The weight of the gold in their saddlebags was matched only by the weight of the truth they carried. When they rode into Prescott, they were a strange sight. Two drenched and mud-splattered riders on exhausted horses, followed by a grateful but bedraggled family. They ignored the curious stares and went directly to the marshal's office. Marshal Davies was a stern, gray-haired man with eyes that had seen too much. He listened to their story, his expression growing grimmer with every word. He examined the letters from the oilskin pouch, his jaw tightening as he recognized the signature of Abram Massey. He looked at the recovered gold, now laid out on his desk, a gleaming testament to a decade-old crime. "I was a young deputy when the Salt River Express went missing," Marshal Davies said, his voice a low rumble. We all thought it was a tragic accident, a robbery gone wrong, covered by the flood. He looked from the letters to Stella, and then to Elias. This changes things. This reopens everything. He sent a deputy to fetch Marcus Thorne from the Overland office. While they waited, the Miller family, true to their word, began telling their story to anyone who would listen. They spoke of the sudden storm, the terror of the flood, and the two riders who had appeared like ghosts to save them, risking their own lives without a moment's hesitation. The story spread through the town like wildfire. The whispers that had once followed Stella, the foolish, stubborn girl, were replaced by new whispers, ones of awe and respect. She wasn't the woman who had lost her job over a number in a book. She was the woman who had climbed a cliff, found a lost treasure, and saved a family from a flood. When Marcus Thorne was escorted into the marshal's office, his usual confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of wary confusion. He saw Stella and Elias. Then his eyes fell to the gold and the letters on the marshal's desk. The color drained from his face. He hadn't been part of the original conspiracy, but the letters implicated his predecessor, and by extension, the company's long history of corruption that he had inherited and perpetuated. The lie he had tried to force Stella to write in her ledger was just one small link in a very long chain. His attempt to dismiss her had, in a stroke of profound irony, led directly to the unearthing of a far greater crime. He was taken for questioning, his arrogant demeanor shattered. The crowd that had gathered outside the marshal's office watched in stunned silence. Stella Hark, the woman they had written off, stood quietly beside the deputy, her reputation remade, not by the gold she had found, but by the truth she had refused to abandon. Weeks turned into a quiet, healing month. The investigation into the Salt River Express conspiracy shook the Overland Stage Company to its foundations. Marcus Thorne, implicated in covering up years of similar, smaller frauds, was removed from his position, his career in ruins. The company, under new, more scrupulous management, publicly acknowledged the crime and the betrayal. The recovered gold was returned to the federal government, and Stella Hark was awarded a substantial finder's fee, a reward for her courage and honesty that amounted to a small fortune in its own right. But the money, as welcome as it was, felt secondary to the quiet vindication that settled over her. The town of Prescott, and by extension the territory, no longer saw her as a dismissed outcast. They saw a hero. With the reward money, Stella bought a small, windswept parcel of land just outside of town. It wasn't a grand ranch, just a few acres of rolling grassland, with a sturdy cabin that looked out over the high plains. It was a place to put down roots, a place that was hers. The new managers of the freight line had come to her, hat in hand, and offered her not just a job, but a partnership in running a new, honest freighting route to the north. She had accepted. She was no longer just keeping the books. She was helping to write the future of the company. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and gold, she stood on the porch of her new cabin. Elias Vale was there with her, leaning against the rail. He had been a constant, quiet presence in her life since their ordeal in the canyon. In his steady gaze, she had found a reflection of her own spirit, a quiet strength, a deep-seated integrity. Her mule, Silas, grazed peacefully in the new pasture, a living symbol of her long journey from loss to belonging. Elias gestured with his chin toward the distant, hazy line of the mountains to the east, where Scorpion Canyon lay hidden. "You ever think about that, Coach?" he asked, his voice soft in the twilight. Stella was silent for a long moment, watching the last sliver of sun disappear. She thought of the bleached, broken wood, the scorn of the men who had dismissed it, the secret it had held so tightly for so long. She thought of how the world had seen a wreck, a failure, a forgotten piece of trash, but it had been waiting. It had been holding on to the truth. "Everyone called it a wreck," she said finally, her voice full of a quiet, hard-won wisdom. "It wasn't a wreck. It was a witness. Thank you for staying with us for this story of incredible perseverance. It's a powerful reminder that true value is often hidden beneath a surface the world has dismissed. If you were moved by Stella's journey, Please give this video a like, and let us know your favorite part in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of history, hardship, and hope. We'll see you next time for another story you won't want to miss.